and thanks for tuning in to the Path 11 podcast. I am your host, April Hanna. At the Path 11 podcast, we are here trying to deliver leading-edge research on consciousness, healing, and metaphysics. And just like you, we are trying to answer the big questions about life. Who are we? Why are we here? And what is our purpose? We hope by listening to our podcast, it will make each day you live on Earth a little easier to understand. And now for today's podcast. Hi, everyone. I am excited to introduce our next guest, Jim Perry. He is also a podcaster, and I came across his podcast. He's doing some interesting things out there, interviewing people about their encounters, supernatural events, and I thought it would be great to have him on the show to help support his podcast, along with just finding out more about his background. The name of his podcast is called Euphomet, and Jim Perry, welcome.
Hey, thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to chat with you this morning.
Yeah. So tell me a little bit about your podcast and what made you get into wanting to hear about people's paranormal experiences and just learn about what's going on out there in the paranormal world.
Yeah, well, Euphomet is a show about the unknown and our relationship to it. And really what that means is that the relationship to it is really the most important part of that equation. I felt that with paranormal stories, with the occult, with the esoteric, there is a shortage of really focusing in on what the personal sort of transformation that can occur when people have these anomalous activity, these experiences that we can't explain. And so, I was really inspired by public radio shows, This American Life and Snap Judgment and some of these audio documentary shows.
Now,
and I thought...
Oh, go ahead. No, go ahead. Sorry about that.
Oh, yeah, no worries. Yeah, I just felt like that this content hadn't been really displayed in that form. I thought I could give it a shot, and I thought it would be kind of like a really great adventure to go on.
Yeah. Now, one of the questions that I was going to ask, I'm sorry to interrupt you, but what have your own paranormal experiences been like? Have you had many, or are you just on this mission to hear more about other people's stories?
Before the show, my personal experiences were limited. I tell a story about how one of the things that was very common when I was a kid was seeing sort of perhaps a psychic interaction between my grandmother and my mother. They would walk to the phone and pick it up and start talking to each other without it ever having to ring. And that was like a daily occurrence in my household and something we never thought, anything about. So there were things like that would happen as a child, and I think these are not too dissimilar to what a lot of people experience. I don't think it's very unique. I think there are these small synchronicities or psychic interactions perhaps that happen to us that we don't really, we just kind of take for granted as being, well, that's kind of weird, but yeah, whatever. But in terms of, I had seen some anomalous light activity, things of that nature. But it wasn't until I started doing the show where I think I was really starting to be challenged by what the nature of reality really is in a lot of ways. And, really gaining some great empathy for the people that I was talking to about these experiences. Because as I went through the show, I experienced more and more myself and grew to understand what they may be feeling about having these experiences. There is sometimes a shame involved in some of this stuff. There is
right.
I don't want to sound like a crazy person because this thing happened. So yeah, the show really, I was right. It didn't turn out to be an adventure. This format did lead to being quite the journey. So.
And was there anything in particular in any of your shows that really began to challenge you the most?
That's a great question. Every show really challenged me in a different way. I think one of the biggest challenges, most broadly, is that the show has taught me that it's very important, I believe, to keep one foot in and one foot out of the entire phenomena. And I have had times where, as a host, of course, I am embedded in these experiences with these folks. But as a host, I try to take a step back and try to just kind of see it the way the listener may be experiencing it. And I try not to make it all about myself. But that's really hard to do when you're there and you're in it.
Right. I hear you.
So, so it's taught me a level of patience, and it's taught me a level of, 1 foot in, 1 foot out. Don't try to believe too hard. Just try to be present. And so that's been a really interesting challenge in terms of particular experiences. I'm sorry I'm beating around the bush here with the actual awesome stories and stuff. But just to give a little context, that's where my head usually comes from. When I was near the top of a red rock mountain, hundreds of feet off the ground, with sort of sheer, 80-degree inclines. And I was on this small ledge, and I was watching my assistant producer, Chelsea, and the UFO lawyer from when I was a kid finish the climb behind me. I was looking out on the vast landscape. I was looking at those guys as they were climbing up to the top in search of a vortex that Peter believed would open at a certain synchronistic date. I did at that moment realize, what did I get myself into with this thing?
Right.
I think the sheer amount of engagement with some of the personalities that I've encountered during the process of the show has been a sort of anomalous experience in its own, right? But I will tell you that with the amount of reality poking that's involved in doing this work, and this, sometimes reality starts poking back a little bit. And it's at those times when you go, okay, what's really going on here? And I can share a story real quick about that if you want.
Yeah, I'd love to hear it.
I was in Ohio. I was in Cincinnati with my friends, the Newkirks. Greg and Dana Newkirk have founded and run the traveling museum of the paranormal and the occult. And they have all these different artifacts from around the world that allegedly have been imbued with some sort of haunted attribute. And they've been donated to these folks. Sometimes they go and pick these things up in just remote areas and backwoods Mississippi or whatever. But anyway, they go through a vetting process. They try to catalog what the actual story is, and just like any good, ghost professional, right? They try to get to the bottom of what if this phenomenon is happening. Why is this phenomenon happening? And is there something that we can do to maybe give some peace to this situation, right? Whether it's spirit-based or something that's more broadly manifested or the like. Well, over the course of collecting these objects, they store these objects in their home. They live with these things. And so you walk into their apartment and you're in the museum. So you're in, sort of like haunted Indiana Jones town. It's amazing and phenomenal until you realize, like, the stories they're telling you is about, this one, this one spits blood, and this one talks, and it's, this one vibrates, and these are just kind of rough examples, but it's like, and you go to sleep in that other room.
Right.
Fully immersed. So they have built up relationships with these objects because of their proximity, because of how close they work and live with these objects. And there's one in particular called Billy. And Billy is an ancient African statue. He's a Nikisi statue. He has been crafted by someone to be essentially like a shepherd for a god. There's a lot of lore that is built into a statue like this. And Greg started to build up a relationship with this thing. This thing, when they first got it, was angry. They showed me recordings they had, and you could audibly hear this thing grumbling and screaming and yelling at people. And so that, they would have interactions, they would do experiments with it. And as it went on, they found in the episode, they found, sort of, what was triggering the statue perhaps, and what was maybe ailing it. And their relationship developed deeper as the statue started coming to Greg in dreams and giving him instruction. And needless to say, this thing was very special. And when I went in there, it was sitting on their shelf on an altar. And this altar was just filled with gifts that other people have come and brought this thing. So booze and money and cigars and, like, you name it. It was on that statue. It was decadent. This guy was a boss. It was clear. So I asked Ken, can I interview it? Thinking, I don't think I've ever said that before about a statue. Mm-hmm. What is this going to be like? And they said, well, yeah, sure. And there was a part of me that was very hesitant about that, because I was experiencing a situation where I was framing boundaries up in my head with something that was perhaps haunted. Is it okay for me to engage with this entity or with this thing? Is it respectful for me to want to capture some of what is going on with it and display it for a mass audience? And so I was starting to already have, like, sort of a weird, there was a moral dimension to it, which was really fascinating to me, considering it was just a wooden statue. But it is psychologically, I think, one of the symptoms of doing this kind of work is that, like, oh, no, like, that's not just a statue. That's, like, obviously there's something there, So you do construct very humanistic boundaries sometimes, and a respect level to some of these things that I think you don't typically get. And so they're like, sure, yeah, let's do it. Let me take out the recorder. And they have this great recorder. Many ghost investigators have it, but essentially, if there's audio, it picks up the audio. If there's not audio, it doesn't record, and you can see it from the little meter if it's actually working or not, or if it's recording sound or not. And so in real time, as you're giving, sort of shooting questions out to it, as you're in the process of interviewing or trying to foster some sort of interaction, you can look at that screen and you go like, oh, there was just an answer. That was an answer. Maybe, or, somebody's stomach rumbled too hard. But anyway, it gives this sort of, like, excitement and I don't know, kind of nervousness to the conversation. If you see those lines on that little screen move a little bit, there's something going on. So he sets it. So Greg stands by it, holds the recorder up towards Billy, the statue, and I start asking some questions. But I'm now nervous. I have now put myself in the space where anything can happen. And I don't know if I'm ready for it. If this thing gives me back an answer, what is my world going to look like post-answer? And especially if he says something that is, cognizant, right? So I spit out a few questions, and they're fairly general. And Greg's reaction doesn't change, and I go, okay, well, I guess that's enough of that. I shoot him like 5 questions, and we listen back to the recorder, and there's nothing. There's no answers at all. And a part of me was like, okay, well, I'm glad that was done. That's not what the show is about. I was not counting for that tape. I felt like I kind of had dodged a psychic bullet in a sense. And Greg goes, no. Well, wait, I think our approach was wrong. Like, I've never done that before to Billy. I've never just held it up to his face like that. Let me sit the recorder on his altar, and let me talk to him for a second. Let me walk away. And so Greg sets the recorder down. He whispers something in Billy's ear, gives him a little caress, turns on the recorder and walks away and says, okay. And so now they've given me and the statue space. And now now it feels real. Mm-hmm. Now it feels like, okay, is he listening? Because this feels different.
Right. So you could even feel like a vibe in the room change a little bit? I
could. I don't know if it was, it felt cinematic, right? It felt like, this round 2, here we go. It felt more like, oh, no, yeah, this is when something is going to happen. It just felt cinematic in that way. And so I think I was riding that wave of the story that was going on right now and thinking to myself, ooh, this is great tape. This is going to sound awesome on the show. And so I kind of like, I take a couple deep breaths. I, try not to realize too hard about what's going on right now in terms of interviewing a statue. I'm in it. And so I start asking questions, but I look around at the room, and then I also start thinking about what I've experienced with sort of seasoned ghost investigators and what their questions usually are, and usually they're emotive questions to really get this started. They're relationship questions. A lot of these folks, when investigating haunted locations, will ask about, an entity's family or what they're doing, what their favorite food was, things of this nature. And so I start doing just that. I ask Billy about Greg and Dana's cats. Which cat they think is the nicest one. Behind Billy is this obsidian mirror. It's a black mirror that I guess Billy has an issue with. I ask him about that. I ask him about what does he feel safe with Greg and Dana and things of this nature. And the full interview can actually be, that portion of the interview can be heard on the episode. I think it's episode 9, I think. But I'm waiting there, and I'm done, and and I had looked at the recorder as I was asking questions, and that waveform was moving after I would say something. And so the entire time I was going through my line of questions and seeing that visual response to what I was saying was building up all of the tension and excitement in the world in terms of, no, that wasn't happening before.
Right.
So Greg walks over and we listen back. And it's this great thing where, of course, it only plays what it records. And so it cuts out all of the in-between stuff. So you're hearing my questions. And then immediately after, you are hearing some form of audible answer to my question. Now, what those answers are, most ghost phenomenon, EVP phenomenon, is left to interpretation. But personally, I can glean what some of those answers might be. And so did Greg and Dana. Greg and Dana did have a visceral emotional reaction to what we were doing as well. After a long day of talking about not only their work together, but how they relate to these objects and how they give them home and how they give them hope. Having some of the answers come back about them personally and their relationship, but from a third party, not from themselves. And Billy really sharing this sentiment that he felt safe, and there was a favorite cat of his, and a lot of very specific answers to what their relationship is and what their reality was one of those things, I think, that has completely challenged my notion of what reality is, for sure.
Well, I would say I could understand why. As you were telling the story, I just did a quick search to try to find this statue, and it led me to the paramuseum.com website. So I'm looking at Billy right now, and I can see the statue. The statue itself could be a little intimidating when you first see it, to be like, ooh, that looks very tribal, very Aboriginal. His face doesn't look too scary to me, but at the same time, with the story that comes behind it, So when you had this recording, were there some audio? Was there some audio that was very distinct, that you could tell it definitely was answering a question. So somebody like myself to listen to it, or your listeners, and, we're not as emotionally involved in it, would we interpret it the same way that you guys did?
I've surveyed people with that, and it's mixed results. And I think that's very typical, especially for EVP recordings, because they're very subjective. There are very short responses that come back in my conversation with Billy that lead me to believe that something is going on there, some sort of interaction perhaps is going on there. But I don't know, it's like, what is it? I don't know. What is it? A spirit inside of a statue? I can't say that with any sort of judged opinion on what that is. So I think that if anything, it's just an expression of this sort of universal game that goes on, where we're sort of playing this game, and reality likes to be playful, and it will express itself in a lot of different ways to keep things spicy, Right. Because it's also so much of whatever this phenomenon is subjective in that way, is that there will be enough sort of illustrative proof or sort of pseudoscientific rationality or completely visual anecdotal evidence, and that's it. And that's all we know about it. And it's just story after story after story that's just like this. So what does that mean?
Right.
Yeah.
Exactly. And if you're collecting enough stories of people, I mean, I think one can gather that it's no longer something in somebody's imagination if we have this, so many people have paranormal experiences. I have yet to really find a person who has never had something at some degree paranormal, or something happen in their life where they say, okay, now I can't explain that. That was weird, or they might say, maybe that was just a coincidence. I don't know.
Yeah.
Yep. Well, thanks for letting me know too about this traveling museum of paranormal objects in the occult. I had never heard of this before.
Yeah, it's really fantastic. They travel the United States. They're always on the road. I know they have a few dates coming up in the spring. I want to try to just hitch my wagon to them going about and doing this sometimes. I think I would really love to see firsthand what the interactions are with some of the guests that experience these objects, because you go in and you get a chance to stand right next to Billy. You get a chance to ask him questions yourself and see what develops. So I think it's a very fascinating project, and one where listen, they're very sentimental people, and I don't mean that as a slight. I mean that as a loving, a compliment. Their whole aim is to essentially show these objects in a different light, and to show, I think, the phenomenon in a different way to people, in a way that is based upon this notion of not being afraid of everything, of embracing some of the strange that accompanies hauntings, objects, ghosts, etc., and knowing that a lot of the fear is sensationalized for some of this stuff. So I think that's their aim, and I think that's really interesting, and I think that's really the more positivity, the better. I think when it comes to this space, especially one where it seems that some level of manifestation goes on, that some level of co-creation is involved in all of this phenomenon. If that's the case, which I think it may be, I'm not sure, then yeah, positivity is better than negativity, for sure.
Yeah. And, what comes to mind in what they're setting up and also trying to do, it's almost like it's a great experiment or a way for people to play with their consciousness.
Yeah.
and the consciousness of another object. Before anything comes into a form, it's a thought, right? So, these artifacts were thought beforehand, and people that created them, there's energy coming from those people, and then the myths, the legends, the energy in which these objects were surrounded by. So, and we can interact, but if you have a physical thing that you can visually see, it almost gives you practice to play with that intuitive part of oneself while they're exploring the quote unquote paranormal, but really, is it really paranormal or just very normal?
Yeah, right. I think you said it so correctly. And in fact, I'm starting to believe that a lot of folks that are involved in not only just sort of anomalous research, paranormal research, but the ones that listen to podcasts routinely, like myself, are actually very, very involved in consciousness expansion, just by the way of the material that you are involved in. I think that people that are into the paranormal are slighted all the time, and I think it's really unfair. I think that the level of folks that claim to just quote unquote like not get it, I think is a bit of a cop out, and I think that these stories and this phenomenon is something that has always been sort of our part of reality. Yet in the past, we've had a deeper relationship with it, and we've had a marrying of spirit and science that is just not a part of our culture anymore. And I think we should reevaluate that. And I think that a new generation is coming up as to where maybe they are evaluating these things. And I think we're evaluating it by very real manifestations that are occurring in our life that are making us confront some of these larger ideas that at one point in time seemed paranormal or in science fiction. And right now we're talking about what does it look like when we colonize Mars? What does it look like when we don't drive anymore and we just drive in Transformers all day long? I mean, it's completely absurd Michael Mann stuff. And we have to think about, like, what are the consequences to us as a society, as a culture, as human beings, when we can just take our brains out and put them in another sleeve or something. So, yeah, I think more people are actually interested in the paranormal. I think that science fiction movies will point to that. I think we all have this lust inside of us for trying to connect with something else, or at least that question about what this all means.
Yeah, and I like, your story and the fact where you said some of your paranormal experience was a bit limited, except for what you witnessed, kind of growing up. But as you began interviewing people and getting more curious, then your experiences started to open. And I know I've heard one of my teachers say that, when you're ready, the universe will begin to reveal itself to you, but, in small increments. But if you're not ready and you still hold a lot of fear as opposed to maybe curiosity, you're probably not going to be exposed or as open too much to that part because the eyes aren't open, right? Or you're not fully awake or willing to be a receptor, to that. So I think it's kind of cool that you're starting to yourself have more and more experiences and being even more curious and optimistic yet skeptical. So I love that.
Yeah, well, thank you. I mean, it's certainly, as I said, has been a journey. To be 100% clear, there was a part in time where the first version of Euphomet, which is different than the series that's out now, I had to essentially end it because of this. I wasn't mature enough, and I didn't really have the tools necessary personally to handle some of the events that were occurring, especially in terms of synchronicities, I think. And most of them were very mundane and very anecdotal and mundane. But enough led to this place where I really was reaching that darkest night of the soul, where I would just kind of like, I would sit up in bed. My wife would be like, what's wrong with you? And I'd be like, well, I just don't even know what reality is anymore. So I'm not sure. And so I think what I was really approaching was, I now stand by the statement that I really don't know what I believe. Mm-hmm. And at that time, when that opinion or when that position was revealing itself, much in the way of how the reality reveals itself, right? I think I was challenged by that in a very fundamental way that just needed some time to like sort of integrate into my personality and in my work. I think that realization led me to completely change how I live, both sort of physically and also professionally. I exited, sort of agency work. I completely changed my career path to working on stuff I just wanted to work on stuff that could be considered, conscious expansion. And I think that's the power of what these stories do. And I think that's the power of stories anyway, no matter if it's a paranormal story or a awesome Western or something. I think that good stories really make us reevaluate, or at least dip into these altered states of consciousness as to where we can explore what our reactions to those are and work through that process. And I think that we do have, at least most of us, have some sort of fundamental reaction to some of this, where we react with fear, or we react with curiosity, or some even react with anger. And if we can learn anything from mystery schools and, ancient Kabbalah and things like this, these are all processes. Organized religion, these are all constructs and processes for helping us to navigate and get through the nature of reality, just in different forms, seemingly. So when you don't have that, and you have pop culture, and that's kind of your religion, which I think culturally is so true for us in the United States and Canada and the Western world, and maybe even globally at this point, you start looking, I think, for, okay, what is my construct here? I'm just like a ship out in the sea. How do I deal with some of these ideas? And so I think at that point, it's much easier to close down to some of this phenomenon and be like, yeah, that is fiction. That is a movie. That is not really happening. Mm-hmm. And I think that makes it even a little bit harder for us to embrace the strange.
Right. I would agree. Your story sounds a little similar to mine as well, when you kind of have that break in reality in that moment. You're like, whoa, what is going on here? I remember when Mike and I did the filming of our documentaries, we walked away from one person that we interviewed, and I said the same thing. I was like, I have no idea what I believe anymore. I don't think I could believe in anything. I was just like blown away. I'm like, all of my belief systems just got busted apart. I was like in shock. I was like, holy crap, what just happened? But there's also a moment of freedom in that too. Like scary freedom in a sense, to be like, yeah, okay, maybe I could just explore, not really have to be tied to any belief per se. Yeah. And then the
other
balancing
side of that is great. Yeah. The other side of that is great. I think that's amazing to hear your story about that happening too. And I think there are more people like us that have those moments, and what they do with it, who knows? But I do think that we should be allowed to have these moments of questioning what this all means, because no one knows. Let's just get that out clear. Like, no one can say for 100%, like, this is actually what's going on in reality and life, and this is how you explain that paranormal. Get out of here. Like, no one can explain that.
Right.
So why can we not have a feeling or opinion or belief system? I think that's great. I think folks should dip into that. But I think the place where you had mentioned, and the place where I am, maybe you're still in this place of being okay with not knowing. Being okay with not knowing.
Yep.
I think as storytellers, especially, and as content creators, right? Yeah. I think that puts us in a great place of possibility, of exploration, of curiosity, as to where we can integrate all these different things and boil them together and see what comes out the other side. And more often than not, we see that some of this stuff is exactly the same. That's the craziest part. Is the more we look back, the more we can see forward. and realize that so much of this repeats itself. So much of this stuff is shares a lineage of stories that is similar, and seemingly it's different interpretations, or it's phenomena through different lenses, right? And so that's a very interesting place to be as a storyteller, I think.
Well, I think it's wonderful, too, that you have created this media outlet for people who are feeling, brave enough to share their paranormal experiences. And so I would like you to let our listeners know if they're interested in sharing their story with you, because we have great listenership. Our audience is wonderful. They are like the audience to talk to. I know that so many of them have had their own experiences, which is why they tune into our podcast. And I would love to connect some of them with you. So can you let them know how people can contact you if they would like to be a guest or share their story on Euphomet?
Yeah, thank you so much for opening that as an opportunity. They can reach me by email, jim@euphomet.com. And you can also just add me on Facebook, Jim Perry. You can add me on there. And we have a group for Euphomet called the Society of Euphomet. That's a space where we all get together and sometimes talk about the shows and give reaction and share some stories. And that's the best way to do that. If you're more of a Twitter person or Instagram person, my handle is it's Jim Perry, @it's Jim Perry. And those are the best ways to contact me. A lot of different choices.
Yeah. Well, Jim, I'm glad we stumbled upon you and found you.
Me too.
It was a great conversation. It's a little bit different than what we normally do, but that's great too, right? I'm usually interviewing authors of books and this and that, but somehow, some way we found you. Our paths have crossed, and I hope that they can continue to cross, and we can just help each other out in the work that we're trying to do in the world, in this crazy world that we don't really know what's going on. So,
for sure, it's an exciting new frontier, and I'm excited. I've met you guys as well, and yes, let's continue this journey together for sure.
All right. Thanks, Jim. And again, for our listeners, his podcast is called Euphomet, and check it out. Contact him if you have an interesting story. So thanks again, Jim, for being a guest on the Path 11 podcast.
Thank you so much.
If you want more information about our films, visit our website, path11productions.com, to purchase DVDs or to rent and stream each film. You can also find our trilogy of films on iTunes, Amazon Prime, and Gaia.com. You can still use our smartphone app for both Android and iPhones. Just search for Path 11 in the Google Play App Store, or if on an iPhone, look for Path 11 in the iOS App Store. Catch you next time.